Welcome to Section 1, an introduction to Active Directory. Our first subpart of Section 1 is going to be related to domain controllers. As we know, domain controllers are an essential part of Active Directory. Now, what are the fundamentals about domain controllers? Well, all of the domain controllers are located in the domain controller's organizational unit. This is absolutely by default. It also is suggested that you don't alter this configuration. One of the primary reasons that domain controllers are located in the domain controller's OU is because it receives default domain controller GPO settings. Now, we'll definitely talk about this GPO a little bit later, but this is there by default in Active Directory. And it has a myriad of security settings that increase the security of domain controllers. So we want to make sure that these settings are applying to your domain controllers, and moving them out of this OU could jeopardize that. Now, domain controllers communicate with all the different devices that are joined to the Active Directory domain, and they do this over LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. Now, LDAP by default runs on port 389, and if you're using secure LDAP, that would be port 636. Not all organizations choose to use secure LDAP, but those that do have to really consider all the different changes that need to occur within the network and different devices to support this. Now, if you want to get a listing of all the ports that are listening on a particular domain controller, you can use this netstat command in order to see all the different listening ports. You should see that, especially by default, 389 is listed there. Now, the main function of a domain controller is to authenticate users and computers. Yes, computers also authenticate. When they boot up, they reach out to a domain controller and authenticate, and therefore both users and computers are on the network and domain controllers are aware of them. It's also part of the reason that you can put a computer on an access control list to access resources. A second function of domain controllers is to deploy group policy and scripts. Now, scripts actually fall under 4 categories. You can have a log-on script, a log-off script. You can also have a startup and a shutdown script. So there are 4 different types of scripts that can fit under a domain controller. So when a user or computer starts up and shuts down, it gets certain settings. Yes, those scripts are actually configured through group policy. So group policy, as you can see, is a really important aspect of Active Directory. Now, other important aspects of domain controllers is the fact that they run what are called flexible single master operations. So they could be a master operator in one of 5 areas. You see that there are 3, the initial 3 here that are listed, which are really per domain. So if I have 3 domains in a forest, I'm going to have multiple instances of these in each domain. The RID master is responsible for the relative ID, which is associated with the security ID of objects, making sure that every object is unique within that domain. The PDC emulator, yes, there is still a PDC type domain controller in the environment, which PDC stands for primary domain controller. And this PDC emulator is responsible for making sure that certain things are unique and controlling certain aspects of the domain. The infrastructure master is also per domain, making sure that things within the infrastructure are unique. The 2 FSMOs, the flexible single master operators, that are per forest would be domain naming to make sure that no domain name is duplicated, and the schema master, which is responsible for the template of all objects within the forest. So a user has a template of settings, a computer has a template of settings, and the like. So these objects are basically the same within the forest. So forest-wide, they're very standardized. Now, the PDC emulator is extremely important for security, and you'll see that in these lists that I'm going to show you now. For example, the PDC emulator is responsible for password changes performed by other DCs, which are replicated with preference. So if a change of a password occurs on the non-PDC emulator, the PDC emulator will receive this change as a preference replication by that DC. The PDC emulator verifies bad password authentication failures. So if a user fails to log on, it'll go to the PDC emulator to make sure that that's absolutely true. And it shouldn't be able to log on. It processes account lockouts. So when a user gets to too many attempts, the account can be locked out. The PDC emulator, because it is verifying bad passwords, will also lock out the account. The PDC emulator also receives immediate replication from other DCs, and changes such as the lockout of an account is unlocked, password resets, right? If you check the user must change password at next logon checkbox, that also is sent directly to the PDC emulator, as well as any state changes for the RID master, meaning if the RID master changes from one DC to another DC, the PDC emulator has to know that because, of course, RIDs are related to accounts to make them unique, and the PDC emulator has to have that information. So here we are in our domain controller console. I wanted to show you exactly where you can see the domain controllers as well as some of the settings that we talked about. First of all, if you come here and search on Active Directory users and computers, this is the main tool that's used to administer Active Directory and where we can see the default configurations such as the domain controllers OU that I talked about. If you open this up, you'll see that my only domain controller in this domain is located in the domain controllers OU. So this is extremely important as we were talking about. I also mentioned that you could run a command to actually see the listening ports for this domain controller. And here's that command here, and here's the output. Remember that port 389 is LDAP, so no other computers on the network will actually be running port 389. So this is a clear indication that this is a domain controller. Now, finally, one of the important issues that we were talking about are the flexible single operation master roles. Here in Active Directory users and computers, if you go to the root level, you'll be able to see an operations masters option. And here you see the 3 domain-based master operators and the configuration for them. And here you can see you can actually change them. Since I only have one domain controller, obviously that one domain controller holds all 3 of these roles. Now, if you wanted to see the role for one of the forest-wide, you would go either into Active Directory Domains and Trust or the Schema GUI. The Schema GUI is actually not there by default. You actually have to configure it to be available on your domain controller, so you'd have to do that. But I can clearly show you here where the operations master is for the domain naming operations master. And here you can see that it's a very similar format to what we just saw in Active Directory users and computers for the domain master operators. But this is the configurations and where you would go inside of the tools to see the domain controllers in the different configuration. Our next topic within this section is Active Directory services.